In the first part of this demonstration, we saw how we can save a particle flow to disk, load with a PRT loader, deform along a path to flow through a pipe, and recreate the same animation using another particle flow that follows the same animation through the pipe and then applies freely gravity or other forces to the particles once they leave the path. And we also use the blob mesh in order to combine the particles and render in another renderer than Krakatoa. Let's take a look at some other things that we can do with this setup. First, let's disable the PF source for now for speed and re-enable the PRT loader in the viewport in order to see where the particles are. Currently, we are loading a sequence of 100 frames that was saved to disk. But if we check the load single frame only, the frame that we pick, the frame 100, will be loaded instead. And since it's not changing over time, velocities make no sense in this case, so the display velocities displays no particles. We'll switch to large dots, and now we can see where our particles are, but they're not moving over time, because on each frame the exact frame 100 is being loaded. On the other hand, the path deform modifier has a percentage along path spinner, which can be adjusted and would move the particles relatively to the path. So if we would go back to about 200% and use this as a starting value, and then go to frame 100 and enter 0 or even a higher number there, you'll see that all the particles will flow through the pipe. And not only that, if we would now go back to the PRT loader and switch to velocity display, our particles have velocities again, but these velocities are automatically generated by the PRT loader based on the deformations applied by the path deform. These are not the velocities actually being loaded from disk. This means that we can procedurally generate an animation of particles by using a single frame saved to disk and animate the deformation modifiers in order to produce new positions and new velocities. If we would go back to particle view and enable PF source 2 and move the time slider, we'll see that the whole animation still works as before. That means that the particles are entering the tube, flowing to the tube, and then exiting and being released to the gravity in order to produce a free style animation once they are done with the path deform. Let's disable the PF source again for speed reasons and take a look how we can modify the actual spline that is driving both the loft and the path deform on the PRT loader. If we would go to vertex level of this spline and grab a vertex and move it around, both the loft and the PRT loader will be deformed at the same time, which means that we can, after the fact, grab any of the vertices and tweak the shape of our spline, or we can select all those vertices and apply an animated procedural modifier, for example a noise with animated noise on and something like 50 50 50 in the strength settings. This will modify both the loft and the PRT loader, but the particles will always stay inside the tube. At this point we can go back to the PF source, enable it again, and see the result. The particles are flowing to the tube, exiting, and then they will be driven by the gravity just like before. Of course, at this point we could also re-enable the blob mesh and get the particles flowing to the tube and creating a single flow as a big blob. We could then disable the PRT loader again and render the blob mesh or the shapes of the particles using a geometry renderer of our choice without actually using Krakatoa features for rendering, and only for animating and deforming the particles.